how-to books on how to tutor and alphaphonics. Mr. Blumenfeld is the chairman of the Massachusetts branch of the Reading Reform Foundation and was awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws from Bob Jones University in May of 1986. Finally, Mr. Blumenfeld has taught both in public and private schools, including a private school for children with learning and behavioral problems. Now, one quick announcement before Mr. Blumenfeld speaks is that we will be taking up, I don't know if we're taking it up, but we'll have a basket somewhere if you want to contribute to the expenses of Mr. Blumenfeld coming here. If you still feel inclined, we would sure appreciate that, and there will be a basket for that purpose. Okay, so we're now going to present Dr. Sandy Blumenfeld.
Thank you, Pascal, very much. It certainly is a pleasure to be with you in Missoula. We're a great center of learning in Montana, higher learning. Here we are, right in the very heart of it. That should inspire us. But something's happening in Montana. Did you know that the verbal scores of the SATs have been dropping precipitously in this state? You know that in the last 10 years, your SAT score has declined 36 points. One of the worst declines of any state in the Union. The state of Washington declined 67 points in the last 10 years. South Dakota, 60 points. Minnesota, 40 points. What's happening? Why these incredible declines in SAT scores when so much money has been poured into education and there's been all this business about reform going on? You've all heard of the education reform movement. It's been in the newspapers and magazines and television for years now. And if you recall, the movement began back in April of 1983, when the National Commission on Excellence in Education issued its now historic report, A Nation at Risk. That report had a couple of lines which have been repeated over and over by legislators, commentators, educators, writers, etc. They said, quote, "The educational foundations of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and as a people. If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we have allowed this to happen to ourselves," unquote. These sober words galvanized the nation into action. The 50 state legislatures passed comprehensive education reform bills, teacher salaries were raised, class size reduced, graduation standards raised. The state of Texas, for example, voted the largest single tax increase in its history to pay for the reform. In 1982, the average teacher salary was $19,274. In 1989, it had risen to $29,567. In 1982, per pupil expenditure was $2,726. In 1989, the national average was over $4,500, and it's predicted that it will be over $5,000 next year. Total expenditure for public education rose from $134.5 billion in 1984 to $199 billion in 1988, an increase of $65 billion in 4 years. In other words, the American taxpayer was willing to finance the education reform movement. The educators had warned us that without a massive infusion of money, there would be no improvement. So America responded. In fact, America spends more money on education than any nation, including Germany and Japan. And because of this taxpayer generosity, the organized teachers of America during the past 6 years have experienced the greatest growth and prosperity their profession has ever seen. The National Education Association's membership is the highest in its history, its income is the highest in its history, and its political power is greater than ever. Never have America's teachers been as prosperous as they are today. But what about the kids? How are they doing? Are they doing better? Has academic performance improved? Has all of this spending and reform paid off? Well, we got the answers to these questions on May 3rd of this year when Dr. Lauro Cavazos, our U.S. Secretary of Education, released his department's 6th annual report card on American schools. The news, I'm sorry to say, was rather grim. According to Cavazos, the high school dropout rate is going up again. The education reform movement has lost its momentum. SAT and ACT scores have leveled off and are still far below their 1960s peak. Education spending adjusted for inflation is up 26% since 1982. We're spending more and getting less for our dollars, said Cavazos. The dropout rate in Washington, D.C., where the NEA has its headquarters, is the nation's highest, 44.5%. We are still wallowing in a tide of mediocrity. We're standing still, said Cavazos. The situation scares me, and I hope it scares you. Cavazos said that the U.S. will invest more than $199 billion in pre-collegiate education this year. We are already spending more money per student than our major foreign competitors, Japan and Germany, yet our students consistently fall behind the competition in comparative testing, he said. We must do better or perish as the nation we know today, he said. Those are pretty serious words. We must do better or perish as the nation we know today. There's no other sector of the American economy or culture that threatens us the way our public education system does. I don't know of any other sector of the economy or culture or of our society that threatens us as a nation. Well, what do you think was the answer of the NEA to all of this? What do you think was Mary Futrell's comment? What do you think she wanted? More money. Exactly. They have a one-track mind, those people. This is what she said. It's no mystery that after 8 years of eroding federal support for education, we find little progress in the achievements of our students. What we are seeing now is the direct result of the educational neglect supported by the Reagan administration. Educational neglect? Never has more been done to improve the lot of teachers in America, and Mrs. Futrell calls this educational neglect. Every economic indicator shows that teachers are enjoying the best times they've ever had. More money, more political power, more influence. And why are the schools failing? You know, it's very interesting that Mrs. Futrell would point out that the government, that there has been a decline of the federal government's share in education in the past few years. That is true. The percentage of monies that the federal government is putting into education is not as large as before. In actual numbers, it's more. In actual dollars, it's more. But in percentage, it's somewhat lower. Why? Because the states and the local communities are putting so much more money in that the federal government doesn't have to put in as much, nor should it. I mean, if local states and local governments want to reform education and pay for it, that's their privilege to do so. Another important thing is this myth that federal federal funding improves education. Total myth. And the figures tell the story. In 1965, the Congress passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act with its famous Title I provision for compensatory education. The entire purpose of Title I was to improve the reading skills of the disadvantaged. What has been the result? Well, 24 years and $50 billion later, illiteracy is now more widespread than ever. In fact, our schools have created an underclass of citizens, all of whom have attended school, but none of whom acquired the basic skills needed to enable them to succeed in our high-tech economy. Right there in Washington, D.C., the very people who were supposed to be the recipients of this incredible federal bounty, $50 billion worth of compensatory education, has ended up with a dropout rate of 44.5%. What does that tell you about the benefits of federal funding of education? And even our best students, forget about those at the bottom, the dropouts, the underclass. Never had an underclass before. Now we have an underclass. But even our best students, those who are going to college, are not doing as well as students of previous generations. In 1972, 2,817 students achieved a verbal score, the highest verbal score, that is between 750 and 800. In 1987, only 1,363 students achieved that score. Less than half the number in 1972. So you see that we're getting fewer smart people, apparently. Brains are becoming scarce. But on the lower level, in 1972, a total of 71,000 scored at the lowest level, between 200 and 249. In 1987, the number of students scoring in that lowest category was up to 123,407. So at the very top, only half, less than half, these days score that high, and at the bottom, twice as many. So we're seeing a dumbing down of the entire American student body. And you know what's so interesting is that every day you read something in the newspapers that boggles your mind. When I was coming over on the plane, reading the Boston Globe, it said here, Americans finished last in International Spelling Bee. Americans are the worst spellers in the English-speaking world, according to results of an International Spelling Bee released yesterday by Gallup International, the Princeton, New Jersey survey firm. So we can't even spell anymore. Of course, that's because they have a new way of teaching spelling in the schools. They now teach creative spelling. You heard of creative spelling? Where the kids can spell it any way they want. Just as long as it vaguely resembles the word. You know, that's known as, well, you see, we don't want to stifle their creativity. You see, we don't want to, you know, we might frighten them away from school. And incidentally, speaking of test scores, as low as they are, believe it or not, here's an article that says that teachers are helping students cheat. September 9th, Associated Press. Educators desperate to demonstrate excellence are helping students cheat on standardized tests, contributing to scores in 48 states that are misleadingly above average, a report charges. So that's gives you an idea of what's going on as far as excellence is concerned. This whole drive, this reform for excellence, is not bringing us excellence at all. It's bringing us closer to disaster. the business people are very concerned about this. They're the ones who have to hire these young people who come out of the schools who can't, do simple arithmetic, who can't read, who can't write. Matter of fact, during my stay here at Missoula, I've been talking to a number of the radio people. One newscaster in this town told me that he has seen a marked decline in the ability of students coming out of schools of journalism. They can't write the news. They can't put a simple story together. He has to do it for them. He wonders what they're teaching these youngsters in the schools these days, but they just don't have those skills. David Kearns, the chairman of the Xerox Corporation, denounced the public schools as a failed monopoly with a 50% defect rate. He said businesses must hire workers who can't read, write, or count, then spend $25 billion a year to train them. It's very interesting how we tolerate this educational monopoly, but we didn't tolerate the AT&T monopoly. I mean, there was AT&T providing excellent service at moderate rates, and yet it was decided that they had to be broken up because AT&T was a monopoly, and they were thwarting competition. Now, what about the whole public school monopoly? That is certainly thwarting competition. I mean, when it comes to costs and prices, they're undercutting the market, aren't they? And they're standing in the way of progress. They're a threat to the very existence of the nation, and yet no one dares suggest that we might break up this monopoly, we might privatize American education. Why? Why is everyone so afraid to even suggest that maybe this monopoly ought to be broken up? I don't have to tell you about the literacy crisis. Here's an article from Time magazine, Losing the War of Letters. We are creating a new generation of illiterates. I didn't know you created illiterates. I thought that if you did nothing, you had illiterates, but apparently we're not creating illiterates. Here's an article from U.S. News and World Report, the burgeoning educational underclass. Nationwide, nearly 1 million students graduate each year unable to read and write, and 1 in 4 never graduates at all. And the problem has been getting worse. Did you hear that? 1 million students graduate each year unable to read and write. How are they possibly eligible for a diploma? What is a diploma? What is it, wrapping paper? I mean, they are graduating and they can't read and write. Apparently a diploma simply says that they warmed a seat for 10 years or 12 years. And incidentally, the educators are warning us of worse things ahead. They're warning us that things will get much worse. And they should know. Shouldn't they? They held a meeting. Our educational leaders held a meeting on June 1st of 1987 in Washington, at the close of which they issued a dire warning of massive academic failure in the years ahead. I happened to be in Tucson, Arizona on June 2nd, and that story made the front page of the Tucson Citizen. Young failures called peril to U.S. Unproductive children turned drain on society. Washington. As many as 1/3 of the nation's 40 million school-aged children are at serious risk of failing in school and society, which would create massive urgent problems for the nation. Leaders of 11 education groups warned yesterday. Their coalition, known as the Forum of Educational Organization Leaders, said this potentially huge number of unproductive citizens will drain the economy in welfare and social service costs and seriously hamper the nation's ability to compete internationally. There you are, they're telling us that we're going to have incredible failure in the years ahead. Now, of course, if you ask the educators, why are we going to have so much failure? Why are so many youngsters not learning to read? Why are SAT scores declining? Well, they become very indignant. How dare certified. We are approved. We are professionals. We have bachelor's degrees. We have master's degrees. We have doctor's degrees. We are the experts. We are the best educators America has ever had. Do you really want to know why we are having all of this failure? It's because millions of American women insist on giving birth to defective children. That's the problem. You keep sending us children with minimal brain damage, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, streptosymbolia, attention deficit syndrome. What are we supposed to do with attention deficit syndrome? You see, that's what they're telling us. There's nothing wrong with them. They are wonderful. They are our educators. It's the kids. There's something wrong with the kids. They're defective. Now, of course, if you believe that, I know of a wonderful bridge in Brooklyn, New York, I'd like to say. Interesting parties. You know what's interesting about all of this is that we know exactly why we have this problem. I've known it for years. Others have known it for years. We've been, baying in the winds about it. We've known it for years. We've known it ever since at least 1955, when Dr. Rudolph Flesch wrote that famous book, Why Johnny Can't Read. Remember that book? You realize that book was written in 1955? And what did Dr. Flesch tell us in 1955? He said, look, Americans, there's nothing wrong with your kids. They haven't suddenly become afflicted with all these strange learning disabilities. The reason why they're not learning to read is because they're not being taught to read in the correct manner. And then he put it in these words. He said, the teaching of reading all over the United States, in all the schools, in all the textbooks, is totally wrong and flies in the face of all logic and common sense. And then he explained how in the early 1930s the professors of education changed the way reading is taught in American schools. They threw out the alphabetic phonics method, which is the proper way to teach children to read an alphabetic writing system, and they put in a new look, say, whole word recite method that teaches children to read English as if it were Chinese, an ideographic writing system. And he said that when you impose an ideographic teaching technique on an alphabetic writing system, you get reading disability. Now, what he said in 1955 was true then, and it is true today. As a matter of fact, in 1982, Dr. Flesch wrote another book entitled Why Johnny Still Can't Read. And in that book he said, look, educators, you didn't listen to me. You didn't heed my warnings. And if you still don't listen to me, you're going to have a catastrophe. And that's exactly what we have today. That's what Laura Cavazos is telling us. We have a catastrophe. Our nation may perish. The nation as we know it may perish. Isn't that serious enough? Wouldn't you think that would shake up the educators? But no, they're still doing the same old thing. Now, perhaps you don't know the difference between an alphabetic writing system and an ideographic one. Before I do that, let me explain the difference between a simple illiterate and a functional illiterate. A simple illiterate is someone who never went to school and never learned to read. We don't have any of those anymore because everybody's got to go to school in America. A functional illiterate, however, is someone who has spent for as many as 8 to 12 years in school and has come out at the end of the process with reading skills so deplorably deficient that for all practical purposes that individual might as well be considered illiterate. You see, you have to go to school to become a functional illiterate. And it's not easy creating functional illiterates. You need specially trained teachers, special reading programs, special books, and it isn't easy keeping someone in school for 12 years and making sure that he or she doesn't learn to read. What do you do with them for 12 years? You know what you do? You pretend to teach. And that's what American public education has become, the great pretense of teaching. All the kids are very busy. They're working in workbooks and, they're crossing things from this page to that side of the page. They're circling things and they're filling blank spaces, but they're not learning. We know. As a matter of fact, the schools are doing such a fine job that we're actually producing youngsters, graduating youngsters who know nothing. They can't read, they can't write, they can't spell, they can't add, they can't think, they can't even speak English anymore. Have you heard some of these young people, their use of the English language? Which is something else that has deteriorated in this country, the use of the English language. I mean, if you listen to young people, you would think they're in some sort of foreign country. Now, what is the difference between an alphabetic and an ideographic writing system? Well, ours is an alphabetic writing system. What does that mean? It means that we use an alphabet. Well, what is an alphabet? An alphabet is a set of graphic symbols, we call them letters, that stand for the irreducible speech sounds of the language. In other words, those letters have meaning. They're not there just for decoration or to make life miserable for children. They actually mean something. They stand for the irreducible speech sound of the language. Now, how do you teach someone to read an alphabetic writing system? Well, this is the way it's done. It's usually done in 3 steps. And this is for all alphabetic writing, whether it's Russian or Hebrew or Greek, any alphabetic writing. The first step is to teach the child to recognize the letters of the alphabet, to know them by name. The second step is to teach the child the sounds that the letters stand for. Now, for generations, for hundreds of years, that was done in a very simple mechanical way. They would teach the child that the letter B stood for the consonant sound book, and then they would take, or the letter M stood for the consonant sound then they would take the consonant letters, join them with the vowels, and they would drill the child in the consonant vowel combinations, such as baby, bible, you, maybe, mimo, you, babe, baba, mama. Very simple, very easy. Anyone can do it. Don't have to be a genius. Now, the purpose of that drill was to make sure that every child developed an automatic association between letter and sound, so that when you see the letters, you hear the sounds. Because an alphabetic writing system is a sound symbol system, like written music, like musical notation. You read the notes of music, you hear the music. You don't see pictures. You don't see images. That's the same with reading. You're supposed to hear it. Once you hear it, who knows what you might think about it. But first you've got to hear it. Well, now once that is done, once the child has developed this association, automatic association between letter and sound, then you give the child words and stories and paragraphs and stories. Now, the alphabet was invented about 2,000 years BC. Now, what forms of writing existed before the alphabet was invented? Well, the earliest form of writing is known as pictography. You know, the cavemen drew pictures on the walls of the caves. Battle scene, a hunting scene. Man looks like a man, animal looks like an animal, tree looks like a tree. In other words, in pictography, the symbols look like the things they represent. You don't have to go to school to learn to read pictographs. However, as civilization became more complex, the scribes had to begin drawing pictures of things that did not lend themselves to depiction. I mean, it's easy enough to draw a picture of a man and an animal, but how do you draw pictures of ideas? How do you draw pictures of right and wrong? How do you draw pictures of good and evil? How do you draw pictures of such concepts as easy, or facilitate, or system, or method, or determine? How do you draw a picture of determine? You can't. So what do? You draw a little symbol and you say, this stands for determine. It doesn't look like determine, but it's determined. And the scribes drew thousands of such symbols, none of which looked like anything they represented, and now you did have to go to school to learn to read. Somebody had to tell you what these thousands and thousands of different symbols stood for. And it was such a difficult system of writing that literacy was restricted to a small number of scholars and priests and scribes who were willing to spend endless time mastering these strange symbols. Now, somewhere around 2,000 years BC, somebody living in the area of what is now northern Israel or southern Lebanon, somebody made